Okay, I think we'll get started, and we're just going to hope that one of our presenters joins us in time. So my name is David Archer. I'm the Head of Public Education at ActionAid and the Chair of the Right to Education Initiative. Welcome to this, I think, crucial session of the C20, talking about education and marginalization in learning spaces. I think possibly one of the most critical issues of our time, especially in the light of COVID and some of the challenges that have been laid bare, I would say, by COVID. So when we're talking, I think, about marginalized children, there's so many different categories and groups of children that we might consider. Obviously, one of the big areas of focus has been girls and women, but also I think people with disabilities, migrant populations, refugees, nomads, children facing the risk of child labour, a growing number in fact, people with mental health issues, LGBTQI people, Indigenous peoples, rural and remote communities, and those affected by crises and disasters. And I suspect that that list could expand indefinitely. It's always dangerous to put up a list because somebody will feel, actually, you've missed this particular group. But the point is that there's a very large number of groups who are marginalized in education, who have faced serious challenges in both access and in learning. And I think many of those challenges have been exacerbated by the COVID health crisis and what is now coming, the COVID sort of induced economic crisis. We know that 1.5 billion children were out of school at the height of the COVID pandemic around the world, and we know that those who were able to access online learning and continue their studies were a relatively small percentage of the total population of children who are out of school, and those who were most marginalized had the biggest challenges in being able to continue learning over those months. I think we are also very clear that as children are beginning to return to school, and it's still very uneven around the world, but as children do return, there are tens of millions of children who almost certainly will not be able to get back to school, who were in school before. And that's, whether it's a result of girls facing early pregnancy, early marriage, or whether it's a result of economic pressures on families, which mean that children are really having to take on responsibility as in child labour. There will be a range of factors, but I think what is clear is these will be things which add another layer of disadvantage or discrimination to children who are already marginalised in one way or another. And I think that one of the really serious worries is that the economic crisis that will be triggered by COVID is likely to cut education budgets in the coming years, unless there's very concerted international action to prevent that. And when education budgets are cut, it's often the children in the most marginalised communities who are the first to suffer. It's the schools in the more remote areas that struggle to get the budget to arrive. Those in relatively better off areas can sometimes be protected. So I think both the immediate health crisis and the economic crisis are going to lay bare and exacerbate existing inequalities in education. And we are going to have to work in a really concerted way together internationally if we're going to address that and make sure that this doesn't massively disadvantage a whole generation of children. So we have a very exciting panel today of people who will be offering their expertise and insights into the challenges of ending marginalization in learning spaces. I hope that through this series of presentations that you will hear, you will see a number of common threads coming out, and we'll try to pull some of those together towards the latter part of this 90-minute session. We are going to start with short opening presentations from 5 panelists, and I'll have a short interaction with each of them to dig deeper into some of the issues that they've raised. And then we will open up to a question and answer from you, anybody who is on this call. If you wish to ask a question, you can do so in the chat box. And we have a technical moderator, Winnie, who will be processing those and highlighting ones which might be pointed to different panelists. Now, before we kick off as a whole, we're going to start with a very short video presentation from, I'm just going to get all the details here. We're going to get a short video presentation, which is actually from the CEO of Plan International, was Anne Birgit Albrechtsen. And this is just a 5-minute video, which I think our technical wizard, Winnie, will be able to put on as soon as I shut up. So let's listen to that 5-minute video, and then we will go to the series of short presentations from our panelists. Over to you, Winnie.
Greetings, everyone. I am A.B. Albrechtsen, the Global CEO of Plan International. COVID-19 has caused the largest global disruption to education in history and has laid bare pre-existing inequalities within the education system that we simply no longer can afford to ignore. The education of 1.5 million learners has been interrupted, including over 700 million girls. Over 11 million girls are now at serious risk of never going back to school. 11 million. The implication for gender equality are clear. Girls are more likely to fall behind in their education, be excluded from distance learning, and not to return to school. This has the potential to roll back substantial gains made in girls' education with long-term effects for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, poverty reduction, health, well-being, and gender equality. The most marginalized, including girls with disabilities, those in crisis settings, remote and rural communities, girls and young people who identify as LGBTQI+, and girls living in poverty have already been most affected. We're seeing a sharp and alarming increase in early and forced marriage and unintended pregnancies linked to the COVID-19 school closures. The longer a girl is out of school, the more vulnerable she is to abuse and exploitation, and the less she's likely to return. Now, an overemphasis on virtual or online learning during COVID-19 has actually further marginalized girls due to the gender digital divide. Even in the contexts with high mobile and internet coverage, girls are less likely to have access to smartphones and computers than boys. Girls' ability to keep up with distance learning is further compromised by the additional burden of caring and domestic responsibilities. A return to normal is therefore neither possible nor desirable. This critical moment in time presents a unique opportunity to build back equal. Education is transformative. It has such great potential to create more equal societies, do away with harmful gender norms, and give girls the tools they need to thrive. Therefore, governments must make it a priority to address the key bottlenecks and barriers to girls' education, including those that prevent them from getting back to school after a crisis. All planning for school reopening should be approached with a long-term perspective that prioritizes equal access, community mobilization and engagement, and making sure no girl is left behind. Governments must also prioritize creating curriculums and investing in learning materials that do not promote harmful gender norms, such as, for example, textbooks in which scientists and politicians are depicted as men. But we need to make sure that we teach children that girls, young women, LGBTQI people, disabled girls, and girls of color can be scientists, software programmers, and leaders in whatever they do. So COVID-19 has highlighted the urgency of closing the gender digital divide in order to ensure that girls can benefit from digital education. Building back equal requires developing accessible and inclusive remote learning opportunities, recognizing that future shocks are inevitable and that all children and young people have a right to quality education, no matter their gender or crisis that they face. Build back equal means deep structural change must occur both in and through education. It means we must tackle barriers to girls' education and ensure that education does not perpetuate unequal power structures and harmful stereotypes, but that it's a force to accelerate sustainable gender equality and full inclusion. And of course, finally, girls and other marginalized children must themselves be an active part of shaping these policies and plans that really impact their education and futures, because nobody, absolutely nobody, knows better what girls need than girls themselves. Thank you.
Thank you for that video, which I think sets a great tone for for our session. We are now going to move on to our first presenter. And I'm very happy to welcome Kevin Watkins, the CEO of Save the Children UK, possibly known to us, many of us in other incarnations, whether ODI, Brookings, the GEM report, UNDP report, or indeed the olden days back at Oxfam, where Kevin was pivotal in the Education Now campaign. So, Kevin, we're going to ask you to speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll go through to the other speakers and then come back to a more interactive session. So over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, David. And I think, as you say, David, that the video really did set the tone. And for me, the important point here that we mustn't lose sight of is that education can be a force for one of two things in society. It can be a tremendous force for equity, social mobility, and opportunity and development. You know, there is no country that does well in human development that doesn't do well in education, if you want to put it very crudely. But we also know that the opposite is true, that unequal education systems reproduce and reinforce unequal societies and an unequal world. And I say that because I believe at the moment we are at a watershed in education history, that the emergency that we're facing now is not on a scale that we have any reference point for. You know, we know that even before the crisis, 250 million children or more were out of school. We know that half of those in school, even after 5 years of learning or sitting in classrooms, were unable to read or write. We know that transition rates in the poorest countries, for girls especially from primary into secondary, were very poor. But what we've had now is a massive global disruption of the of education systems across the world. We have never had 1.5 billion children locked out of classrooms, not for just a few weeks, but for over 6 months in many cases, and rising, of course, for a lot of countries right now. Now, there's a study of what happened in Kashmir after the earthquake, of children who were living closest to the fault line, who were out of school for 3 months. And what the survey results show is that 5 years later, those children had lost the equivalent of 1.5 grades of learning. That is a minor shock by comparison with what we're dealing with now. And so I believe there's a very real risk of not just millions of children not going back to school, especially girls who are forced into early marriage, but of children going back to school, being left further behind, and dropping out in later years. The critical question in all of this is what do we do? And I think as an agency that's operating on the ground, my colleagues are working with local communities, working with schools, working with governments on not platform-based distance learning, but radio-based learning, in particular, mobile libraries and other interventions. I think it's critical, and Rukmini will talk to this way better than I can, that these are education systems that were already failing children. And it's vital that when children go back, they're taught from where they are, not from where an artificial curriculum dictates they should be. So we need learning assessments, we need support for learning. I know, David, that I think I was asked to comment specifically on financing, and I wanted to come to that now, if I could. There is no resolution to this crisis without a fundamental step change in global financing provisions for education. What we're seeing right now is education budgets hollowed out by the impact of the recession and revenue losses, by the diversion of government spending and aid spending into the public health response to COVID. We're seeing, on our estimates, around 15 low-income countries, these are IDA-eligible countries, who are spending more on debt servicing than they're spending on education. This includes countries like Ethiopia and Zambia. And we're seeing a huge underinvestment of resources. Now, I believe that three very simple things need to happen here. At least they're very simple to say. They're much more difficult to make happen, of course. I think, first of all, we need to convert what are unpayable debt liabilities into investments in education. And this will require private sector commercial creditors who have so far refused to participate in debt relief, participating, not just in a suspension of debt service payments, but in a reduction of debt service payments. So point one, let's convert unpayable debt into investment in education. We can't have the poorest countries in the world spending $45 billion a year debt servicing and diverting. Sure. Second point, I strongly believe that unless we can get the wholesale financing part of the international system behind education, and for practical purposes, that means IDA. We need a supplementary IDA budget of at least 35 billion, I would say, with at least 12%, 15% of that earmarked for education in the poorest countries. Thirdly, and I know this is more controversial, I believe unless we can get a credit guarantee system like the IFED proposal that Gordon Brown has developed up and running, it will undermine our ability to mobilize low interest credit for the poorest children in the world through their education system. So I think for me, they're three big priorities. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I think that absolutely concurs with what so many of us have been working on around the financing of education. If we're going to end marginalization in education, we know that it's going to need a sea change in the financing of education, both domestically and internationally. So we're going to go on to the other speakers, and we'll come back for a more direct interaction with you, Kevin, a little later. We're going to go now to our second presenter, Graham Lang, who's the Chief of Education at Education Cannot Wait, having spent many years with UNICEF in a whole range of different capacities. Education Cannot Wait, I think all of us are probably aware, set up at the World Humanitarian Summit, and really a crucial global multilateral mechanism for supporting education in emergencies. I know that Graham himself has been involved in the Rohingya response in Bangladesh recently and in many other countries around the world. Over to you for 5 minutes, Graham.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. Yes, as you said, education kind of we're the global fund for education in emergencies and protracted crises, and since that World Humanitarian Summit in 2016 and our inception in 2017, we've made investments in 39 countries, of which 35 are currently active. These investments have been done through two main windows with ECW. One is our first emergency response window, which is for crises or an onset of a crisis or an escalation of an existing crisis. And the other one is our multi-year resilience program window, which is very much focused on protracted crises. Now, while we've got formal evaluations of both of those windows, either ongoing or upcoming, which will give us a better understanding of how our funds are targeting the most marginalized, looking at the proposals that we get, I thought would be a good way just to give you 3 quick lessons that I think we're learning through our investments to date in terms of targeting the most marginalized. I think the first one, and it's maybe very obvious, but I think the first one is really around the needs assessments that are done at country level. And what we're seeing is that if the needs assessments themselves don't explicitly build in very targeted questions around addressing marginalizations, those then don't come through in the resulting strategies. So whether it's marginalization around gender, whether it's marginalization around location, whether it's disability, if those are not as part of those needs assessments, then they get lost in the strategies and we don't see them coming through. And that's very obvious. And we need to understand we need to get better data. We need to understand the risks associated with those children and adolescents in those situations and what those barriers are before we can move on to the theories of change and then how we address that. So that's the first point. I think the second point is we're seeing that we need to invest more in local organizations that are actually on the ground, that are present, that have that specialized expertise. And the example I give is the recent round of COVID-19 responses that we did. We ask explicitly in our application forms to do the analysis on the most disadvantaged, to look at who is the most marginalized, and then to translate that into actions. We went a step further, in fact, in the recent COVID response, and made explicit reference to targeting children and adolescents with disabilities and also girls at secondary level. And we were very explicit, and we had a series of interactions with our partners in developing their proposals. When they came through, we still didn't see, despite the fact that we were asking explicitly for programming directed towards those marginalized groups, we didn't see it coming through. And getting back and having those discussions with those partners on the ground and asking them why that was the case, one of the main reasons was around the capacity of organizations that are in those locations. And we're looking at crisis affected areas. We're looking at children and adolescents who are constantly on the move, where you've got forced displacement. We're looking at host communities. And one of the reasons was these local organizations that either were physically not present in those areas or were already at full capacity. And I think that's one of the areas we feel that we need to invest in more with our local partners, is building the capacities to be able to respond. I think the third part is really a bit of a shift, a sea change in terms of reorientating our programming. I think when we're looking at marginalization, if we're very serious about leaving nobody behind, we more and more are advocating we have to start the programming from that perspective of those most marginalized populations. It's not about embedding them into strategies. It's not about trying to integrate them into those broader things. You need specific, in many cases, and we're looking at, particularly for, as I say, children with disabilities, in a lot of these areas, if they're affected by forced displacements, you need specific strategies that target those populations. It's not sufficient. We're not seeing that it's sufficient to just embed them into those programs. And I think as a result of that, there are two main sort of implications as a result of advocating for that approach. I think the first one is around the cost, coming back to the financing. To reach those most marginalized groups, whether it's geographically, whether they're in remote locations, whether it's the specialist expertise to be able to offer education for children with disabilities or learning disabilities, or whether it's other issues around language, the unit costs invariably, not always, but invariably are higher. And so with a fixed budget, the implication of all of that is that you reach fewer children. However, if we're serious, and this is where I come back to this point, if we're very serious about starting with those leftmost furthest behind, I'm going to finish right now. For those behind, we have to start with them. They have to be right up front in those strategies, and we have to allocate the funds accordingly. Thanks very much, David.
Thank you very much, Graham. I couldn't agree more that absolute equity as this sort of lens at all moments from the start and right the way through. Now, I think people will be delighted to hear that after 3 white men speaking, we're finally going to diversify a little bit, and we're going to hear now from Lukmini Banerjee, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Pratham Education Foundation in India, having played a pivotal role over so many years in doing learning assessments, and particularly the very famous ACER report, which is now being copied in so many other countries around the world. I'm delighted that we're now going to hear for 5 minutes from Lukmini Banerjee.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here to hear from everyone. I thought maybe I could talk a little bit about the existing marginalization that we see in places like India, and I'm sure that's common in other places. Some things are visible and some things are invisible. So the children who are out of school are visible, and you can enumerate them. You can come up with specific ways in which to bring them to school. But one of the problems that we've been dealing with on a very large scale are the invisible marginalized populations inside school. So if you're inside school, in many contexts, you're thought of as already privileged because you have the access to education. But if you're in school and not learning, then it's a large, hidden, invisible, hard to get a hold of. And then if you can't see the problem, then often it's very difficult to solve them. And so I think that the work that we have been doing for many years is really to, how do you make this invisible problem visible? And if the problem becomes visible, then how do you take it to a solution? So if you're in, like Kevin said, if you're in school and have been in school for a number of years and still don't know some of the basic skills of reading, of simple arithmetic, of writing, and so on, then you also begin to marginalize yourself. When millions of children begin to lose confidence in their own ability to learn, it kind of depresses the entire system's ability to even provide the opportunities which may be right in front of you. Interestingly, the study that Kevin referred to, it was a study done on the border of Pakistan and Kashmir after the earthquake. The findings, and we've been, the authors of the study actually have been joking, saying that if this study had come out at any other time, it would have been just one more study. The fact that they have it now is giving them a lot of attention, but I think it's an important one, because what it shows is that 5 years after the earthquake, if you look at the villages and the families were close to the fault line, their economic characteristics actually came back to pretty much what they were at pre-earthquake. But the learning of children did not. And again, it goes one step further to say that this learning gap or deficit or whatever you may call it is actually attributable not as much to school closure, but to what happened after the schools opened. And that, I think, points to the fact that right now, there's a lot of things being lost because of the crisis, health, economic, education, and so on. But what we have in our hand is what we should do when schools open. And I hope we can come back and talk about it. I don't want to take up too much time now. But I think there is a unique opportunity by reprioritizing what we need to do right now. There's a unique opportunity to actually lift the bottom of where our sort of non-learning children were before COVID started. And this is an important moment because at least we say in India that we have a demon that we can blame all evils on. And the demon is called COVID. And we can focus, because any other time that you talk about deficits, there's always a going back to history. But if we say that for the last 6 months, we've forgotten what our history is, and it's COVID that has caused all the problems, we have a good fighting chance to actually be able to go back and build back better, as our first speaker said, and really be able to take all of those kids who had fallen to the bottom of their class or their school and give them a chance to come up. So I'll stop there, but I hope we can come back and talk about it.
We will indeed. We'll be coming back to chat to each of you in turn. But thank you very much, Lukmini. I think that, yes, build back equal, in fact, is what Anne was saying at the beginning. And I think, sometimes people think better, equal is better. And that's the problem, is that sometimes some visions of better are not necessarily focused on equity. So I just really like, and I think that this is going to be a thread coming through, this sense that COVID is a potential turning point, and it can be a positive turning point for a transformation in education. Not a matter of going back to how things were. It's about using this as a moment for a change. Really positive and exciting. So now we're going to go to our last of the key presenters, Kate Moriarty, who I've known for many years. He's a qualified teacher, and that's just a little nod to the teachers who yesterday was World Teachers' Day. And let's remember that without teachers, we're never going to improve the quality of learning. We need to put teachers at the centre of our response. Kate herself, having been a teacher and then a doctor at the University of Sussex, has worked at UNESCO as a chief of section in the Peace and Human Rights section, and is now at the Interagency Network for Education in Emergency as a senior advisor on strategic engagement and dialogue. So over to you, Kate, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, David, and thank you. I actually got a few slides. So I'm going to try and share my screen and hope that works. So first of all, thank you, David, for the introduction and for remembering the teachers. I think it's a really important point, and one that hopefully we'll get on to later. Thank you also to the C20 Secretariat for organising this, for the government of Saudi Arabia, and for my fellow panelists. And it's always hard to come after such great speakers, but I'll try and hopefully add something to the debate. And it's really interesting to hear how it's coming through the discussion about marginalisation from education, marginalisation within education. So just to start, I really wanted to say, for people that have joined today, with thanks to everybody that's joined to listen in and bring questions to this discussion, just to say that if you don't know INEE, which is the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies, we're an open global network, and our way of working is really to work through an interagency approach. And our members are NGOs, they're UN personnel, ministries of education, researchers, government, other government staff, donors, and importantly, it includes those living and working in crisis contexts, so refugee teachers, refugee students. So let me try and go to the next slide, which I've failed to do. I've done that wrong. Anyway, I think I just have to do it in here, so my apologies. So I really wanted to focus in on the children and youth affected by crisis, because even before COVID, and yeah, we're talking about COVID and we can't not talk about COVID, but even before COVID, these children were extremely marginalised, and we've heard a bit about that already, including from Graham with the work of ECW. But as has already been said, there were 258 million children already denied their right to education before the onset of COVID. 30% of those children lived in countries affected by crisis. And we know among those, girls, children and youth with disabilities, refugees are among the most marginalised. For example, I think the latest figures from UNHCR show that 48% of refugee children still don't have access to education. That's barely shifted in the last 10 years. So we know that conflict, environmental disasters, health emergencies like the one we're seeing now, forced displacement, they all remain really significant barriers and are key to, we need to address these to end marginalisation in learning spaces. So as I said, INEE brings an interagency approach. We've been in existence for almost 20 years now, and our mission is really to ensure the right to quality, safe, relevant and equitable education. And I really want to stress the focus on quality education, because I think, without quality education, which means quality teachers, financing, we can't have equity in learning either. And INEE we really want to promote for everybody and everything we do across all our members the need for to follow the minimum standards in education for preparedness, response and recovery. So since the onset of COVID, as we've heard, we've heard from the previous speakers, we've had 1.5 billion children, or billion learners rather, out of school at the height of the crisis, which was back in April. There's still over 50% of those who were enrolled in school are still not back in school, not to mention all the children that were already excluded from school and denied their right to education. We've kept a focus on continuing support for learning and well-being during the school closures, and kept that focus on the most marginalised. One of the issues that we really wanted to draw attention to, and that, while we know that school closures have, been necessary in part to stop the spread of transmission of COVID-19, we felt that too little attention has been given to the other needs of children. We know that education, and other panelists have already touched on this, the other things that education brings, which is protection, children out of school, I think in the video at the beginning, Anne mentioned that girls out of school are more at risk of early pregnancy. We know that there's a number of child protection risks, especially for children that are already living in pre-existing humanitarian crisis. So together with the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, we called for a more balanced and contextualised approach to school closures. So really looking at what's happening in the local community, talking with teachers, talking with the parents and children themselves. And then when it's safe to do so, obviously reopening schools to make sure, because as the longer children stay out of school, the less likely they are to return, but also the more risk they face in terms of, being forced into child labour, sexual violence and exploitation. So this for us is a really important aspect. And finally, again, I want to go back to the point that as INE, we work as an interagency approach, so that all stakeholders, all our members, partners, all of us have a role to play in ensuring that we end marginalisation in learning spaces, despite the now increased challenges that COVID-19 has brought us. But thinking about this as a C20, I also really wanted to highlight the role of the G20, because we do know that it makes a really big difference when, world leaders play their role. And the G20 leadership is critical in prioritising and financing education, not only in their own domestic settings, which of course now with COVID-19 has said it's a global education emergency. As Kevin said, this is the first time we've seen children around the world shut out of school, but also in their capacity of donors, that's really essential. Together with some colleagues from the University of Western Ontario, with the colleagues from CIPPEC in Argentina, with UNICEF and UNESCO IIEP, we published a policy brief we wrote a policy brief that was published yesterday, looking at COVID-19 and the global education emergency and planning for recovery and resilience. And in that, we highlighted a number of key issues, and I'm coming to an end, David. So one of those—
We'll come back to that in the second round.
is integrated crisis-sensitive planning, the importance of continuing continuity and access for the most vulnerable, and reintegrating those children that weren't in school into school, to address not only teacher supply and well-being, but also their working conditions, to strengthen risk analysis and to use data and get new and better data, and also to increase domestic as well as global financing. So I really want to call on the G20 to, together with everyone, to play their role and show leadership in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. So now then, I'm going to remind everyone that this is an opportunity for you to ask questions to any or all of our presenters as well. You just need to put your questions down in the chat box. We will review those and we will try to channel your questions to the people that we have here. But we're now going to go back to the beginning and I'm just going to ask a couple of immediate follow-up questions. So first of all, to Kevin, Kevin Watkins from Save the Children. Can you say something about how we can make education systems more resilient in the face of crisis? I mean, if COVID has had such a dramatic impact, is there something more we can do to make systems more resilient?
Well, I mean, that's a very tough. So the vulnerability of education systems, if you measure them by their learning outcomes and by what they do for the well-being of children, are partly a function of what goes on in the education system, and that includes, you know, the critically the training and support of teachers. Building on Kate's point, it includes the proper provisioning of learning materials. It includes having a credible curriculum. You know, there are so many countries I visit where I open textbooks and it's almost comical.
Yeah.
You know, you open a textbook in northern Kenya for, you know, in a school for pastoralist children, and the textbook is showing pictures of Kikuyu farmers growing tea in fertile areas. So, you know, I think those issues within the education system are critical. But in the end, resilience is also a function of underlying finance and political commitment. And, you know, if you have political leaders who don't see the importance of education, you know, who don't understand the importance of equity in education financing, you know, the principle of equity should be that the children with the greatest need have a greater claim on resources. There are in most countries in the world, it's the opposite, and that is a source of vulnerability as well. I'm not just talking developing countries here. The US is a standout example of that. So, you know, I think you need a combination of education planning in the areas that I mentioned and proper financing for education systems. Finally, David, you know, in the end, this is also about the resilience of children. And that's a very germane point at the moment, because we've got about 150 million children additional who are being pushed into poverty. We've got another 6.5 million children who are facing the prospect of extreme malnutrition. That you don't get resilience in learning systems when children are hungry and impoverished. So, you know, you have to have the out of school support, the safety nets, the cash transfers that make it possible.
Yes, no, absolutely. I just want to follow up a little bit on that question of resilient financing for the system, because it seems to me that we do spend, perhaps as an international sort of education people, a disproportionate amount of time talking about international financing, which, relatively speaking, is a small part of the pie, even in lower income countries, particularly given that paying for teachers is such a large part of the budget, and most governments won't employ teachers based on short-term temporary aid or loans. You know, if there's a lot of focus around the share of the budget going to education. People have often talked about 20% of national budgets going to education, but if it's 20% of a very small pie, that's a small amount. Is there more that can be done to strengthen and expand domestic tax bases in a fair and progressive way?
Well, you know, I don't think that's a challenge unique to education. Like, you know, the revenue losses that happen as a result of tax avoidance and tax evasion are enormous in low-income countries in particular, especially, I should add, in countries with large mineral deposits where, you know, there's a long history of revenues being siphoned out via offshore centres. But, you know, there's an equity principle on the revenue mobilisation side as well, which is that, you know, by and large, in many countries, high-income groups with large assets, whether in the form of property or land, are undertaxed, and of course that weakens the financing base for revenue system. I guess the one thing I would emphasize is that at a time like this, if we're talking about resilience, where you have a massive exogenous shock at a time when the fiscal space available to governments is shrinking, you know, you can increase the revenue base. You can't do it in year one. And what we're talking about here is a budget crisis in year one. And that's why I think financing through the international system is particularly critical at this moment.
And debt suspension or cancellation or reduction. I think that's the immediate money is there, isn't it? Really, on debt. So I agree with that. Look, thank you very much, Kevin. I want to keep moving the conversation on, so I'm going to go over to Graham now, if that's okay, and ask say something about what you would see as being the main drivers of discrimination in education globally, and what we can do to confront and dismantle them.
Yes, thanks, David. I mean, I think that it's sort of in line with what Kate was talking about, and I think we see one of the largest groups of children and adolescents who are systematically denied access to quality education are those impacted by forced displacement. So those who are themselves forcibly displaced, as well as those host communities that receive them. And I mean, again, sort of picking up, Kate, you took the same statistic I was going to say in terms of, for refugees, for example, 50% of those refugees globally only having access to education. At primary level, that's 23% don't have access. At secondary level, it's just over 30% of those refugees have access to secondary school. So I think, that as a driver, as one of the key drivers that we see in Education Cannot Wait, that issue around forced displacement. I'm talking here specifically about refugees, but of course, there's also a huge number of internally displaced populations. And again, one of those drivers, and if you look at the Central African Republic, where we have huge movements of the population on a regular basis, largely due to the insecurity in that country. That is a huge barrier to those children and adolescents getting access to any kind of quality education. Mm-hmm. And coming back to the refugee issue, one of the things that we've been working with and we support fully with behind UNHCR is the work with national governments to include refugees in their national education systems. And you've got some terrific examples of that, for example, in Chad, which has an amazing open door policy towards refugees. It accepts them into the country and includes them immediately into the national education system. There are other countries where that is not the case. And just by being virtue of a refugee and having crossed that international border, that is a huge driver of then not being able to access education within that country. And I think sort of coming back to the point that Kevin was making around financing, we can request these countries that already, many of them in fragile contexts, to step up to the plate and ensure those children and adolescents are included in those systems. But I think from our side, from the international community side, we need to then step up to the plate in terms of the financing. And I think now more than ever, and I know, for all the reasons that Kevin and others have said, the fiscal space, as it were, is very constrained. We're asking the donors behind Education Cannot Wait, the donors behind other organizations, now is the time to invest in education, because the losses that you're experiencing as a result of those children not having access, are immense. And it's going to cost more in the long term to get those children back into school and give them a quality education the longer we wait. And I guess
I absolutely. I just wonder one other follow-up about sort of international cooperative efforts. So look, you're very much at the heart of Education Cannot Wait. There's also the Global Partnership for Education. Kevin has mentioned IFED as a new financing facility. There seem to be a number of global mechanisms, and perhaps a bit of a proliferation of global mechanisms that are claiming to harmonise funding for developing countries. Can more be done to ensure that we don't end up increasing the transaction costs and genuinely cooperate and make sure efforts are harmonised behind government plans?
Yes, I think always more can be done, David. I think, one of the key things that we focus on, and we work through the education emergencies coordination mechanisms in each of the countries that we support. And for us, in terms of coordination, in terms of efficiency, in terms of those transaction costs, That's where we put our efforts. It's at that country level in ensuring that the financing flows that are coming in are targeting those areas that are most disadvantaged and those children and youth that are most impacted by these crises. And we feel that strengthening those aspects around coordination is critical. And you know, there are some very, I think, very instrumental global level instruments which are extremely helpful. I think the Global Compact for Refugees, which has been developed, and again the Global Refugee Forum at the end of last year, really for us has been a transformational moment in terms of really aligning that support. You've also now got the UNESCO Global Coalition, which was launched as a result of the COVID-19 response, which is doing a lot of work around that coordination piece. And maybe just lastly, one of the things that we've been involved with, and it's great to have Kate here, is we've been recently supporting the INE, UNHCR, and the Global Education Cluster on an ongoing piece of work over the last few years, looking at that coordination piece, trying to get those efficiencies particularly at country level, and trying to learn the lessons from how we can better ensure that those investments are directed to the right populations.
Thank you very much again, Graham. So I'm going to pass over to Rukmini now. And a couple of things. First, perhaps, could you say something about how we could best support marginalized young people themselves in their efforts to mobilize against exclusionary and discriminatory social structures?
Big question. Let me give you a small example. In this last, couple of months, my organization, Pratham, we worked directly with about, strangely, before the crisis, we were working directly in about 7,000 villages. But in the last couple of months, that contact directly with families and with children has actually doubled, which is kind of weird because, you've not been able to move, and yet somehow things have become closer. But I want to take an example from one of our, most educationally backward areas in India, from Uttar Pradesh, where in a particular block of about 500 villages, that we were already working in, we could see that as the crisis progressed, that looking at something at the village level or at the school level is insufficient. We need to break and think about the habitation in much smaller ways. So these 5,000 villages are actually composed of something like 2,200 hamlets. And our idea was that schools will open at some stage, but there's going to be we are going to need to be able to kind of carry children with us from home to school. And some of that, I don't want to call it pulling, because I think children will go quite happily, but some of this extraction, may need a lot of local by not even village, but even more local efforts. And so in these 2,200 hamlets, we've been looking for local, absolutely like neighborhood youth, just maybe a little bit older than the children that we are in. And all of this, of course, is happening through the phone and through WhatsApp and through other things. To me, it's very interesting that in this time, we've been able to actually identify and mobilize almost 18 to 1,900 young people who are right there from where they are. And it's done two things. One is it has shown us what are the hamlets where we could not find someone like this. Those hamlets tend to be of two types. One, which are quite wealthy or relatively better off, which don't need this kind of local level mobilization. And the others are so badly off that we couldn't find a young person who could actually give. So this hamletization of the village has actually helped us identify those areas which are going to need the most help as soon as we are going to be able to move. Now, the second thing that I find very impressive is that we are doing two things right now. One is after the village, we go to the hamlet. And as soon as we have a contact in the hamlet, we try to establish contact with as many parents as possible. So the parents that you can connect to directly are the ones that have a phone of some type. And the parents who are being contacted by the volunteer are the ones who don't have that direct connect. So again, there is, who is who. These young people they're not paid or anything. It's just like, you call people and say, do you have an hour? Can you give a little bit of time? And maybe because right now movement is not possible, their own colleges or whatever they were doing is not possible. We see a lot of energy in kind of trying to help your immediate neighborhood. And the fact that the crisis has hit everyone in some strange way has brought you all to the same table. Usually crises hit some places and not others, right? And the third thing I want to point out is that, in our normal times, we run what we call learning camps to help to boost the learning levels, we call it teaching at the right level and so on. And that's all done with some amount of teaching materials, some face-to-face trainings, people visiting you for on-site support. And we measure all of this, learning improvement quite closely. We are seeing that I think that both the children and the volunteers all are dying to get back to some kind of structured activity. We are seeing actually quite promising results from this very remote and, probably not very rigorous support that is given. So I think one way, David, long answer to your, important question, is that young people, when they feel they can make a difference, whatever level close by, I think, rise to it. And I'm sure this is something that all of you have experienced. Sometimes the most bad areas are the easiest to work in because people are so keen to come together and do it. People who are better off often are, I hate to say this, but a little bit more selfish or looking inwards into their own families. So
and I think you're absolutely right. This thing about COVID being an opportunity for building remarkable levels of solidarity between groups.
And I was talking to some government people earlier today, and I said that we are talking to a lot of teachers. Everyone is kind of dying to get back to the real thing, whatever the real thing was. And I think the real thing is connecting back. If you're a teacher to your children, if you're a children to your teachers, and we've got to ride this, when this is going to be possible. I've been saying this, and sometimes if you say it enough times, it'll happen, you feel. You can go from this mindset of this is a crisis, to this is going to be a celebration, because it's going to be the most looked forward to school opening of all time. And you have to enjoy the party and make it last.
That's a good positive outlook. I very much appreciate that. I'm going to go to Kate Moriarty again now. Perhaps you could share some thoughts on what can we do to protect education systems, ensuring that they remain public utilities available for all.
Thanks, David. Okay, I'll try and address that question. First of all, I just really want to pick up on the last point of what Rumiki was saying about, because for INEE, the community participation, I think for all of us, that really illustrates, that's a foundational principle in the minimum standards for education. And I think it's so important, and it can't be overlooked, not only, as you say, to actually, for these young people to be fulfilling a purpose and feel useful, but, actually bringing their experience, I think that's just such an excellent example. So, thank you for sharing that. Because I think, it's often when you say these things, but when you have an example, it's really, really powerful. So, I think maybe just to answer your question, and, this may seem like a kind of obvious point, but I think it really is important that we remember education is a human right, and that governments have obligations. And of course, for, in crisis context, that remains the same. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic is bringing, as we've heard, challenges across, every level of life, right? All of us have experienced it, and some people in much worse conditions. But we must not lose sight of the fact that education is a fundamental human right. Governments do have obligation, and also the international community in 2015 made some very specific commitments linked to SDG 4 on what would be achieved in the next 10 years. Now, nobody could have anticipated what was around the corner or 5 years down the line when that happened. But I think, to the point that you made, David, about domestic budgets, I think that is really important. We do know that, we do need governments to even with the challenges, to maintain their budget spending or increase it to recommended levels, because I think it was, as Graham said, or Kevin said, or maybe everybody said, we know that investing in education now is really a driver for change, right? Education is a right in itself, but it is also a catalyst for regeneration. It also, promotes peace and tolerance. It really is key to ending marginalization. Not only, we're not only talking about marginalization within education, but in society. Education is a key driver for equity. But I do think also that humanitarian financing is really important, and harmonised donor support, as, Graham touched on. We have seen, I remember when I first started working in this area, kind of lobbying what was then the Fast Track Initiative, now the Global Partnership for Education, to include a focus on children in conflict and crisis context. We've seen the formation of Education Cannot Wait, which has had really significant impact on the financing. However, we only have to look at the Global Humanitarian Response Plan for COVID-19 to see that education still in humanitarian crisis and in this global crisis is not prioritised. We need that to be prioritised. We need governments, donors, we need everybody to realise just how important it is to invest in education. That's not to make education it's only good for something else, because education in and of itself is important, but it is really fundamental. And then one thing, and I know that, there's, Kevin touched on this, and I don't want to, I know there's a lot of kind of onus put on private actors. For us, and I think, we're just about to publish a paper on this, I think if you do have private actors, that has to be regulated, and it has to not undermine, it has to support and build into to national, education systems, and really, look for a sustainable path. That's not a sustainable path. The sustainable path is domestic financing. So, I don't know if that answers.
Thank you. And I do think there's the Abidjan principles, which were put last year, I think, are quite an important resource for that in terms of,
I meant to mention
what are the government's obligations in terms of public education and the obligation to regulate private provision, but to build a coherent system.
Absolutely.
I'm going to now, because we haven't had yet any questions coming up in the chat box from the wider audience. So I'm going to come around now to a question to each one of you in turn. It'll be the same question, given we are here in a C20 meeting, and it's in a sense a constituency that should be putting pressure on the G20. We know that next week the G20 finance ministers are meeting, and then in mid-November the G20 heads of state are meeting. What would be your top one or two messages, each of you, for taking to the G20 in order to end marginalization in learning spaces? And I'm going to give the person who's got least time to prepare, Kevin, given that you are our first presenter, any immediate thoughts? What comes to your head first? What should the G20?
Yeah, I got the short straw there. Well, look, it's a tough question because let's face it, most of these governments have a far better record or a far stronger record in generating marginalization than in combating marginalization. So I would keep my demands focused on things that they can make a difference on. So what they would love to do is obviously wax lyrical about how important education is, how committed they are to equity and ending poverty and all that stuff. But what we need to see them doing is delivering in areas where their decisions could count. One, they could, in the next couple of months, agree that the private creditors who are currently securing around $15 billion a year in debt service payments from the poorest countries cut that debt. That's something they can do. Yeah. They could agree a supplementary IDA budget of 35 billion, which would release probably 3 to 4 billion for education. That they have it in their gift to do. They could agree to support the IFID proposal, which would release new resources for investment in education. Now, they could agree to put resources into Education Cannot Wait, which is an absolutely fantastic facility supporting education on the front line. These are things they can do, right? So I would urge them to spare us the platitudes on the great principles they believe in. Spare us the sermons on equity. Actually do something, and there are 4 things they could do.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you very much. I only asked for one, but that's a pretty good combination. So spare us the platitudes, give us the money, I think is a pretty good top line message, and absolutely on those points. I'm going to come over to Graham. What would you like the G20 to do?
I think it's always very difficult following Kevin, if I can just say that. I mean, I think, the COVID-19 crisis, as we've all said today, I think has overlain another crisis on top of existing crises, particularly for those most marginalized. And as I was talking about earlier, those who are affected by forced displacement. And for us to sort of reinforce Kevin's message, I think our key message would be now is the time to step up to the plate in terms of your existing financing agreements that you have with organizations such as Education Cannot Wait, but with other organizations as well, but also to actually to maintain those commitments, but at the same time to increase them. And we're looking for new donors to step into this space at this moment in time to try to raise those funds. That's what we're trying to do as a global fund: increase more money for education in emergencies. And I don't think you could get a bigger emergency than this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Lukmini, what would you like the G20 to do?
David, as I said, I am clueless about all these global things. But I would say that in terms of national priorities, money is scarce. Things are being cut in all sides. But I think the fact that once schools open, you want every teacher to be there, energized, and because they are the real stabilizing force. We have been, the fact that schools closed was perhaps the biggest hit into every household. And I think once schools open, there is a very huge need to make sure that there is a stability. The world outside may be a very unsafe and a very uncertain place, but at least for children, to make sure that the hours they spend in school can be the most secure place. And for this, we need to ensure there may be many other cuts for education, but teachers' salaries have to be paid and have to be paid on time.
Thank you very much, Rukmini. And Kate?
So not to repeat what everybody else has said, but yes, to repeat what everybody else has said, financing, but also G20, please, a plea is to focus on pre-existing humanitarian crisis, because these children, the children and youth in those contexts, education systems in those contexts really need support. So that, the G20 can play their role as well as within their own national domestic context as international donors, both development donors and humanitarian donors. And also to think about, the pledge that was made in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Everybody knows, leave no one behind, but also within that opening text, there's a pledge to also start with the furthest behind. And I really think that's important. We must start with those children and youth, whether they're the forcibly displaced, internally displaced children, refugee children, girls, or children with disabilities, children and youth with disabilities. All of those are really important. So I think, really focusing in on the hardest to reach context and the children that are furthest behind. And just one more thing, if I may, I also think that overall, and I don't know if this is the G20, but I do think a lot of this comes from G20 donors, is what do we understand by quality education? It isn't just about academic outcomes. And I think particularly after we've seen we know this in humanitarian settings, that psychosocial support and social emotional learning is really important. And right now, and I think, from the things everybody said, and particularly the examples from, country examples from India and stuff, we know that children and youth, they really need that, they need more than the academic, It's going to take time to catch up with learning, but they also need the social, emotional and support as well.
So now I'm going to take advantage and answer my own question, what I would like the G20 to do. And I'm going to slightly cheat by saying I think they should sign up to this 4S framework for the financing of education. They should pay attention to the share of the budget going and making sure that governments are getting to that 20% of national budget, so exceeding it, and conditioning any support on governments maintaining or increasing their own domestic spending as a share of the budget, because so many countries are still underspending, and there will be squeezes on that share of the budget as a result of pressure to increase investments in health. There's no point increasing that share of the budget if you don't look at the size of the budget overall, and actually that's about the size of the tax base, expanding tax to GDP ratios in a fair and progressive way. That's something where there is actually some concrete proposals being put to the G20 this year by OECD about how to tax the digital economy and particularly the big tech companies. We're not very optimistic that it will be particularly groundbreaking, but getting the richest multinational companies who have made huge profits in this period to pay fair tax in the countries where they're making a profit should be fundamental. Got to look at the size of the budget overall. So share the budget, size of the budget, sensitivity of allocation, and that is what we've all been talking about. Let's get the money to be focused on equity, reach the most marginalized, reach the most furthest behind, take an intersectional approach, get serious about reaching the most disadvantaged and those who suffer greatest discrimination. So how you allocate your budget with that as the dominant lens is fundamental. So share, size, sensitivity, and then scrutiny, because we all know the money doesn't, the most disadvantaged schools, the money doesn't arrive if you don't have independent tracking and scrutiny of what's happening with that budget in practice. So we'd like to see, and this is a framework that the Africa Union Ministers of Education picked up in 2018. I think it's a framework that we should get the G20 to get behind, the 4 S's, increase all of them, because otherwise we're going to see a serious collapse of financing for education. And that framework works both in terms of domestic financing and aid to education. We need more money coming in aid budgets. We need it to be part of a larger commitment to aid overall, and 0.7% has to be sensitively allocated based on where countries need it, not based on geopolitical preferences and colonial histories. And it certainly needs to be scrutinized, because too often aid money is a source of particular misuse and corruption. So that would be my own answer to my own question, which is cheating somewhat. There is now a question. We have 15 minutes left, and we now have a question which has come in, which is about how would you take a systems approach in a protracted crisis? For example, in the Sahel, parts of Niger, Mali, and Burkina, so heavily affected by so many different issues, from climate change to conflict to economic crises. There's a question coming from Jesus Melendez. What would it take to take a systems approach to address the marginalization of education in that context? Anybody want to jump in with that?
I would like to, if
yes,
other panelists are okay, David. Thanks for that question. I mean, it's a very pertinent question with the upcoming ministerial roundtable on the Central Sahel, which is coming later this month, in fact. I think, an initial response to that would be looking beyond emergency financing to multi-year financing for these protracted crises. I think if you're serious about addressing the systemic issues, you need to have predictable financing. And one of the things that we're doing in the Central Sahel across those 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, is actually, in fact, today we started the development of those multi-year financing programs. And one of the clear messages we've been passing is the need to include in that process the linkage between the humanitarian response and development efforts. And part of that will be looking at the education system itself, in terms of reinforcing that capacity and having that system-wide approach. So I think that's perhaps a simplistic answer to a very complex question, but it's that multi-year predictable financing that we feel is critical to those systems issues.
Anybody else want to jump in with an additional comment on that?
I mean, David, if I may, just maybe to add to that, just in terms of being able to do that so it's the multi-year, financing and planning. And I think a really important part of that is having the right data, because we need to know, how many children and youth are affected, who are those children and youth, who are the most marginalized if we want to reach those first. So I think we've seen kind of initiatives recently. UNESCO had a global meeting on education management information systems for crisis contexts. This is something INE's worked on across our membership and with NORAG last year. So I think really having robust data, that also does mean investing in data collection, but I think that is really important, so that the kind of education system analysis can be done. Also, I think it was Graham touched on earlier, the role of coordination, which is really important, and supporting our colleagues working in the global education cluster and in those coordination settings there in each country. But I do think data is a really important to being able to take a systems approach. So.
Thank you. There is another question. It's quite a sweeping question. Do you think education systems all over the world will be unified in their objectives? I think will be or should be, could be an interesting framing. And I think I'm reminded of Kevin's opening statement here that, education systems are sometimes used to domesticate, to reinforce the inequalities and injustices of the societies that they serve, because they're not equal, because they privilege an elite and they perpetuate inequality. But it can be that systems can be used as one of the most powerful equalizing forces in a society. If you manage to build a genuinely equal, equitable education system with good quality and access across the spectrum, it can be an incredibly powerful force for unifying. And I think one of the challenges, so behind this question, do you think systems all over the world will be unified in their objectives? I think different systems have different objectives. And in fact, those two competing agendas, in my view, exist within every education system. That there are forces at work for trying to create education as this sort of passport for mobility and increased equality. At the same time, there are forces pushing the other way. Does anybody want to chip in with some observations or sparked by that very broad question?
Education systems, just from the face of it, look somewhat similar across the world. There is buildings in which you put teachers and children, and then you throw some books at them, and then you test them from time to time, and so on. But I think that as you go deeper, this will sound very simplistic, but I think of what is it that you want kids to do and you want teachers to help them do, and how successful is this whole package in actually getting to what the goals are. That is a sign of equity within the system, or the chance of some kind of equality of opportunity. So, for example, I look at countries like ours, where really the curriculum is here, the teachers here, the children are here, and the parents are there. And so there is between each of these layers big gaps, and people can't help each other. And really the villain in all of this is whoever designed that age grade curriculum to be where it was. And why over a period of time, India has been independent for now almost 75 years. Why haven't we brought it to where it is within the grasp of the normal teacher and the normal child and the normal parent? So I think
the curse of the education experts.
Yeah, the negative consequences of an overambitious curriculum which was designed for somebody else's children, I think is I like to unify the world on that principle, that of these 3-4 things should be close together. And then together you can raise the bar as you become capable to do. This use of, for example, PISA across the world now in all kinds of countries, just completely, PISA was designed for somebody else, somewhere else. Large numbers of people in India wanting to go to Finland. There's, it just doesn't make sense. And I think Land Pritchett has a very nice word, that there is this huge amount of isomorphic mimicry within the education system. And perhaps if the system didn't look alike, you would be freer to do your own thing that made sense in your own condition.
And that's a really powerful message, I think. It connects very strongly with the agenda of this webinar, which I think focused on marginalization, because if you're going to respond, you need to contextualize, you need to adapt to the particular context and challenges of the children in a particular classroom and within a particular system. So excessive standardization, and there has been a drive to somewhat excessive standardization and a sort of reduction of how you're going to measure that standard thing is, I think, potentially problematic, which is not to say that quality standards are not crucially important, but if we overly standardize and think that all systems are the same and that we can measure them in the same way, there are challenges. Does anybody want to come in with additional observations on that? We have 7 minutes left.
Well, I was just going to repeat what I said earlier, which is I think that, within the SDG 4, and I think that fits really nicely what you're saying, there's this objectives up here, and I think it is really important that we have these global goals. We have SDG 4, but we shouldn't lose sight of what quality education is, and we shouldn't just have a drive for learning outcomes that are academic learning outcomes. I do think that's really important. Of course, reading, writing are really critical. They serve a role, and I sit here as someone who can read and write, and it puts you in a much better position in life. So I'm not saying that's not important, but I think within all contexts, whether that's humanitarian context or not, I think the importance of other aspects of the curriculum, the psychosocial, global citizenship, all that's really important. Going back to and starting, I think that another point that Ramuki made earlier, which is, where the young people are in the community, starting from where they are and using their experience and engaging them in dialogue around education curriculum. I'm just going to put it out there that as a student who went through the British education system, I'm fairly typical, although I do speak Spanish, but the vast majority of people second language, or at least not very effectively. And one might say that that would be a pretty good indicator of a quality education system, but it's massively downgraded because we haven't valued it in the UK adequately. And that's one of those weird distortions, isn't it? That some things are valued more than others. Kevin, you wanted to come in on this.
Well, really, I was just going to endorse what Rukmini said and add one point that, look, when you have half of the children, I can't remember the details of the last Pratam study, but, it's a pretty consistent story. The children get to grade 5, and on average, they're at grade 2 level reading. And, these are children who have put a lot of effort in, their parents have put a lot of effort in. That is a system that is failing children. And it's failing children for exactly the reasons that Rukmini said, that you've got a curriculum which is frankly out of touch. You've got teachers who are trained to teach in rote. And I've sat in some of those classrooms and it's excruciating to watch. But I do think there's another aspect of this that, I used to sit there cringing when I was in UNESCO, listening to all these reports of the latest mission from Ghana that had gone to South Korea or gone to Finland or whatever to discover the magic ticket. And I think the question of how do you take education systems in which, let's say, half the population don't even get into secondary school, where you've got an incredibly thin base to recruit a teaching workforce from limited budget resources, of how do you actually move up levels? One of the ways you move up levels, if you're doing it equitably, is you do find ways both of designing curriculum that are relevant for the poorest, most marginalized children, but also you put resources where they're most urgently needed. And honestly, there are so many countries where I look at the budgets, and for every dollar that is spent on a child in the poorest 20% from the public budget, another 5 are spent for children from the richest 20%. That's the opposite of what it should look like. Exactly the opposite of what it should look like.
Yeah. So building equitable, allocations of budgets and distribution of resources is crucially important. I'm very struck by this idea of the curriculum being up there and so distant, remote, constructed often quite a long time ago. I want to just throw in there that some of this is about colonial legacy, and that part of what is sometimes needed is a sort of decolonization of the curriculum globally. I think we've still caught up with conceptions of education, not just the curriculum, but conceptions of the models of education that have not been fundamentally challenged or criticized or reinvented for a different era. Maybe this moment of COVID is the moment that we can ask some more fundamental questions, both so that we don't just go back to the old way of things, but we actually open up some of these questions more fundamentally, and we end up with education systems that genuinely respond to the needs and rights of all of those who are accessing the system. And at the moment, I think we're quite some way off from that. So, if we were sitting here 5 years ago, we would still have as much to say about marginalization as we do today. I hope that we won't be in 5 years from now coming back to this same discussion, because I hope that we are going to use this as a turning point for making some sort of breakthrough in a sort of reimagining, rethinking what education can be and how to make them into this positive equalizing force in the societies, in each society. And globally as well, I think. And I think, this the overall framing of a sustainable development goals, let's not forget that part of what we should be doing is looking at how do you build education systems that contribute to the achievement of all of the other sustainable development goals. And that means, a pretty different model of economies and societies. And there's a long way to go, let's say. We are now at the 4 o'clock UK time and the allotted end time for this webinar. I'd like to thank everyone who's been involved. Thank you very much to our presenters, Kevin, Graham, Lukmini and Kate. Thank you also very much to those who secretly behind the scenes have been keeping things ticking over. So Winnie, our technical moderator, thank you very much. And to all of those who helped to set this webinar up. There will be sort of core notes and a recording of this webinar for those who want to come back and revisit it. I found it very interesting, stimulating being with all of you as panelists. So thank you very much, and let's keep in touch, and let's hope that this sort of level of discussion in the C20 is reflected in one way or another in the G20 meeting that is coming up. So thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are.